The South China Sea is experiencing another eventful week as China steps up the pressure in the region with escalations against the Philippines. The Philippines government, for their part, are not backing down from the continued Chinese provocations and are pressing their case to an international audience. These publicizing of the actions being taken by the Chinese has upset the Chinese Communist Party by making them look unreasonable, and it is a party that is obsessed with not looking unreasonable on the world stage. An issue that became apparent this week is that both sides are making alterations to their tactics, but neither is backing down. The question is for both sides and the world to ask is, will these changing tactics make a difference? Or is it a slow path to a crisis that could lead to an escalation? And what many analysts fear is a war that will take place in the most valuable maritime commerce route in the world, and the confrontation will involve the US and China. The more likely outcome is that despite increasing tensions, a war will be avoided between the two countries. The most notable event this week was a confrontation between the Chinese and Philippine Coast Guards and the Chinese maritime militia in the Scarborough Shoal. The recent confrontations between the Chinese and the Philippines have been at the Second Thomas Shoal and the resupply of the grounded Filipino Navy ship, the Sierra Madre. The latest incident in the Scarborough Shoal began when a Philippine Coast Guard ship and a Philippine Fishery Agency ship were conducting a patrol in their internationally recognized Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ. The mission was to provide supplies to Filipino fishermen and to allow them access to the fishery. The Philippine ships were intercepted by 4 Chinese Coast Guard and 6 maritime militia ships that trailed and then aggressively maneuvered to block and slow the Philippine ships. 2 of the Chinese Coast Guard ships used water cannons against the Philippine Coast Guard ship for over an hour, causing minor damage to the ship but no injuries. The type of damage to the Philippine ship indicates that the water pressure used by the Chinese ships was at a much higher pressure than previous water cannon attacks and caused more damage than usual. This was also the first time that the Chinese used this level of force against a Philippine Coast Guard ship. The Philippine Fishery Agency ship was also water cannoned by 1 Chinese Coast Guard ship. The Philippine ships continued their patrol but appears to not have accomplished their mission in the shoal. The Coast Guard noted that the Chinese have reinstalled a 415-yard, 380 meters floating barrier to block the lagoon of the shoal to prevent Filipino fishermen from entering the fishing area, and the Philippine authorities were prevented from removing it during this patrol. The Scarborough Shoal has no standing structures, where the Second Thomas Shoal has the Sierra Madre, and is in the Filipino EEZ, but the Chinese Coast Guard and Maritime Militia has maintained a constant maritime presence there since 2012 in the waters in and around the shoal. The Chinese Foreign Ministry, responding to the event, accused the Philippines of violating their sovereign territory and that they would take whatever action is required to protect their territory. The Chinese claim nearly the entire South China Sea, and is a claim that has been ruled by international courts as illegal. But China ignored the rulings. The Chinese Foreign Ministry also stated that the previous president of the Philippines entered into a gentleman's agreement, and the current government reached an agreement this month with China to not escalate tensions based on a common understanding in the region by an unnamed source in China. Both agreements are quoted by the Foreign Ministry as a tacit acknowledgement that the Philippines recognize the Chinese claims in the region. This means, from the Chinese point of view, is that the escalation is caused by the Philippines not honoring the agreements, and they are responsible for escalating the tensions. The Philippine government of President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has denied that any such agreements existed, and in the rule of international law, such an agreement, if it did occur, would not be binding. The Philippines, having granted international media access to the vessels patrolling the disputed waters of the Philippine EEZ, so they have ample documented evidence to make a claim to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea against Chinese provocations. This will most likely not make a difference to Chinese behavior, but their aggressive actions cannot be denied and well documented to shape world opinion. The Philippine Defense Secretary, Gilberto Teodoro, stated that his country will need to not telegraph its missions into the disputed regions within its EEZ. Teodoro said future missions will also need to continue as a matter of national dignity. He did not state what his options were, but it seems clear the intent is to not repeat the same tactics as before because they have become too predictable and easier to counter. Teodoro is correct in his assessment of the situation, but it is an open question is if the Chinese will view the changes as being escalatory. It is assumed these new tactics would also apply to the Second Thomas Shoal. Separate of the Scarborough Shoal incident, the Philippines are currently conducting an exercise with the US and France called Balikatan 2024. This year's version of the exercise involves it taking place in the Philippine EEZ and not along the territorial waters as previous Balikatan exercises. It is also introducing new weapon systems by both the Philippines and the US, and will take place in locations that would conceivably be used against China if they invaded Taiwan. The Chinese have predictably claimed the exercises were provocative, but the exercise is being dictated largely by China's claims and threats over the South China Sea and Taiwan. The Chinese are also spying on the exercises. Balikatan 2024 has 14 nations who are observing the exercise, and China made a point to insert itself, uninvited, into the observer nations' locations. This caused a halt to the live fire exercises that were scheduled for Sunday, April 28th, because the Chinese sent 2 spy ships and 1 frigate to shadow the exercises and interfere with the pre-arranged location of the exercise. This was the only interference in the exercise so far to date, other than the continued presence of the spy ships. The Chinese also sent a research ship into the Philippine EEZ this week. The Chinese-flagged ship was in a stationary position and had not issued a distress call or answered contact attempts from a Filipino Nomad N-22 military aircraft. The Philippines also dispatched a ship to the area to intercept the Chinese vessel and to observe and shadow its activities in their EEZ located south of Taiwan. It is unclear what the purpose of the vessel, but it appears to be collecting data and not on a peaceful research mission, which would also be a violation of the Philippine internationally recognized EEZ. The Chinese are becoming more aggressive and bellicose toward the Philippine government in both the use of water cannons against 2 Philippine government ships. It is also using 2 unsubstantiated claims that they are the victims of the Philippines breaking agreements with China. This claim is twofold in that the claims make the Philippine the treacherous aggressor, and that the claims are tacit acknowledgement from the Philippines of China's claims in the region. Both seem to be highly unlikely, but also, if true, they are still not binding because no signed agreement by either government can be produced. This appears to be another use to enhance grey zone tactics and try to attempt to sway international opinion. The Philippines, for their part, continue not to back down from the Chinese claims and are showing the world the tactics of China that will most likely be put before an international court. The Philippines are also ignoring China's demands that no foreign elements enter the South China Sea disputes. The Balikatan 2024 exercise, in addition to taking place in disputed waters, is introducing 2 foreign elements in the US and France, and the French will also hold a separate naval exercise with the Philippines that is outside of the Balikatan exercises. France and Japan are expected to sign additional defense agreements with the Philippines soon. Defense Secretary Teodoro signaled that Philippines will not back down as a matter of national pride, but that it would change its tactics to make it harder for the Chinese to predict and lead to a act and counteract cycle that could escalate. The tensions in the South China Sea are being escalated by both sides, with the Philippines having the edge because their position in the region and their EEZ are internationally recognized. However, it is unlikely that this will become the flashpoint for a war in the Pacific. China is well aware of the defense treaties between the US and Philippines and Japan and Philippines, and that a war in the West Philippine Sea is not a war China would want due to the proximity of US forces to the Philippines, and that most of the potential combat area would be beyond the Chinese mainland-based air force and would require its navy to operate in hostile waters with little air cover. The Philippines, with their alliances, if they continue to press their advantages, will have the upper hand. The Chinese, on the other hand, cannot risk a war that would be a disadvantage to them and would risk the plan in a dangerous and risky gamble of force projection. They need to keep the plan intact if they hope to invade Taiwan, and an invasion of Taiwan would require the US and Japan to sail within Chinese air coverage and further from their bases of operation, unlike a war around the Philippines. A war in the West Philippine Sea is the war that China does not want, and would be a strategic error if it was drawn into one. And the Philippines are aware of this fact. If the Philippine leadership stays focused, and they shape their policy that leverages Chinese disadvantages and leverages their alliances, they will continue to have the advantage until such a time that Chinese have a larger and credible aircraft carrier threat or break out of the first island chain. Until then, the Philippines can press their case, knowing that the Chinese will not risk a war at this point.